are Bob Tarantino and Sundeep Chauhan.
Thank you. How many people here have ever actually played Dungeons and Dragons? Nice. So the rest of you are lying. Okay. Sundeep and I are going to tell what I think is actually a fairly interesting story. It's one which looks at the intersection of intellectual property law and technology and, most importantly, culture, because I think there's some interesting observations which we can make about how people create things and how people make use of cultural artifacts which are protected by intellectual property law. Plus, D&D just generally is pretty awesome, and so I think it's worthy of discussion. What we're going to talk about today is how intellectual property law and technology came together to lead to what is called the old school Renaissance in the world of Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games more generally. How do we...
Do we do it?
Yeah.
Just tell me.
Okay, so when Sundeep and I were talking about how to handle this session, I was sort of dumping on him all this information about Dungeons and Dragons and about role-playing games and the history and how these things work. And I could tell he was getting this sort of freaked out expression because he was like, what have I gotten myself into here? So I assured him I would handle all the really nerdy stuff and he can handle all the smart guy stuff. So I'm going to start with some background on the history of Dungeons and Dragons so that we just have some context for what we're talking about, what the story here is. So to make a long story very short, Dungeons and Dragons was created in the mid-1970s by two guys named Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. D&D is a role-playing game. It's intended to be a multiplayer game. It's played with polyhedral dice, which are these sort of strangely constructed dice that you throw. It's sometimes referred to as a pen and paper game, meaning that unlike traditional board games, there is no board, and its abandonment is in favor of a narrative structure. So there's a very strong narrative element to the game, where you have a single player who acts as the game master, or the dungeon master, if you will. And other players adopt various personas or characters, which they role play as the characters undertake various adventures. So most of us will be familiar, even if you haven't played Dungeons and Dragons, will be familiar with things like this through multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft. The vast majority of computer games have some kind of genetic inheritance from D&D. I'd be happy to claim that Dungeons and Dragons is actually found in the DNA of most iterations of fantasy and popular culture today. D&D didn't just sort of spring miraculously out of thin air. It had its own predecessors and antecedents, and the primary ones are the ones that I've listed on the screen there. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was published in the 1960s, Sword and Sorcery pulp fiction from about the 1930s to the 1960s, so that's things like Conan the Barbarian, the works of Fritz Leiber and Clark Ashton Smith. Many of these works were cited in the original editions of Dungeons and Dragons as being inspirational and sources of sort of inspiration for the authors. The third precursor, and probably the most important, were what are called war games. War games are board games, and they're played with little figurines. So I don't know if you've ever seen like the little originally lead, now they're mostly plastic soldiers and tanks and weapons. War games were games which strove to realistically recreate actual military conflicts, so things like battles in World War II or the American Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars. And Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were avid wargamers who had what in hindsight was a pretty brilliant idea. And they took these games which place a lot of emphasis on realism and historical accuracy, and they sort of played what if with them. And they said, well, what if instead of, this army unit from the Civil War having a cannon, they had like a dragon? Or what if instead of this guy having a really big gun, he could like cast a fireball spell? And they sort of mixed all this together. And from there, they ended up with Dungeons & Dragons, the game that we know today, which involves people sort of spelunking through dungeons and fighting goblins and finding books filled with magic spells and riding unicorns and whatever else happens. In 1974, they created Dungeons & Dragons. And this was, I want to emphasize this because this will sort of recur later in today's story. This was a hobbyist endeavor at this point. So they're printing things up in their basement. The paper quality is kind of crappy, and the illustrations are pretty rudimentary, and there's spelling mistakes, and it's all a little weird. And this thing first becomes the genesis of this sort of odd little community, which springs up throughout North America. So you had these D&D players who would get together for conventions so that they could play D&D with each other and meet new people. And they'd write their own adventures, and they'd type them up on their typewriters and mail them around to each other. And they created zines, so amateur magazines, which were photocopied and sent around in circulation. And the D&D role-playing game culture was this sort of charming amateur do-it-yourself DIY culture, which existed under the radar and sort of developed organically for a number of years. And people were sort of finding out about this game and reworking it and playing with it and kind of making it their own. And so one of the sort of salient features of role-playing games is what's referred to as a house rule. Most people, when they play Monopoly or Battleship, let's say, they sort of play Monopoly and Battleship as those rules are written. Role-playing games have house rules where the players have found something in the official rules that they don't like or they think is kind of strange, and they modify it to suit their own tastes and their own purposes. And then by the late 70s and the early 80s, Dungeons & Dragons had turned into this absolute cultural phenomenon. I don't know how many people here were sort of around back then, but this was a fad. For about 5 or 6 years, Dungeons & Dragons was selling millions of copies. It was a huge business. You could buy it at department stores. It was being denounced by preachers in the U.S. as sort of being responsible for encouraging Satanism amongst kids. Tom Hanks starred in a movie which played up the dangers of kids playing role-playing games and becoming like deranged lunatics. There was an expose on 60 Minutes. It was, for a few years there, it was like a really big deal. And throughout the history, just as a side note, throughout the history of D&D, intellectual property law has actually sprung up as this sort of recurrent feature. So there was a falling out between Gygax and Arneson in the late 70s, and in order to get around paying Arneson royalties, the company that owned D&D, which was called TSR, came up with a new version of D&D. So they called it Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And they said, Dave Arneson, you're only entitled to royalties on like basic Dungeons & Dragons, the original Dungeons & Dragons. And so there were all kinds of lawsuits flying around. And we'll see on a couple of the later slides that these IP issues keep recurring. So throughout the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons remained quite popular. In 1989, a revamped version, the second edition, was released. And over the course of this decade that we're talking about here, an entire industry had been created. So Dungeons & Dragons was for fantasy, and it had fantasy-based competitors, but there were dozens, even hundreds of competing role-playing games in other genres, so westerns, horror, superheroes, science fiction. The list was sort of almost endless, but Dungeons & Dragons was, by any relevant measure, sort of the preeminent game and the most popular in terms of commercial and cultural success. In the 1990s, though, Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games in general sort of went a little bit sour. So video games started becoming the dominant kind of leisure activity amongst young males who have historically been the largest audience for role-playing games. And within the gaming industry, things moved in favor of card games. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Magic the Gathering, or if you've watched Big Bang Theory, that's the card game they're always playing. So TSR was slowly sliding into bankruptcy by the end of the 1990s. The company that created Magic the Gathering, a company called Wizards of the Coast, bought TSR, and hence they bought the intellectual property in Dungeons and Dragons. And they thought to themselves, well, how can we revitalize D&D, this sort of iconic game? Basically they said, how can we make some money out of this? What can they do to bring the game back to life? And they did two things at the same time. In 2000, they released the third edition of the game, and they implemented the open gaming license. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That'll be the focus of our discussion, the open gaming license. We'll get into it a bit later as to what exactly the open gaming license was and what it did, but suffice it to say that it kept D&D alive for the next decade and a half, let's say. And more interestingly for our purposes, it prompted what's called the old school Renaissance, which was, in a literal sense, a rebirth of old Dungeons and Dragons. But in order to sort of get into the old school Renaissance and into the open gaming license, we need to talk about what intellectual property is and what it has to do with all of this. Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. So, basic question. Are games protected by intellectual property rights? The answer is sort of. Under U.S. law, it's built right into their copyright legislation, games are systems, and they are not protected by copyright law. Canadian copyright law is a little bit fuzzier on the topic. There's a case that we rely on from the 1950s which says that copyright doesn't exist in any arrangement, system, scheme, or method for doing a particular thing. And a game, when you sort of break it down to its constituent elements, is really just a process. It's an arrangement. It's a sort of a system. So copyright law is not intended to apply to the mechanics of games. That being said, there's this fundamental notion in copyright law which divides the world into sort of ideas and expression. Ideas are not subject to copyright protection. Expression is subject to copyright protection. The idea of a story about a boy wizard is not subject to copyright protection. Anybody can write that story or write a story based on that idea. The expression about the boy named Harry Potter and he goes to a school, gets slotted into a house and they play games and fight each other and whatever. That expression is protected by copyright. You can sort of map the notion of our games protected by IP rights onto that system, onto the idea versus expression dichotomy. So games, in the sense of their system or their scheme, are just ideas. Those are not protected by copyright. Games in their expression, the actual iteration of the mechanics, are protected by copyright. So, Monopoly. There's no copyright protection for the idea of, buying and selling real estate and traveling around a board. But the actual particular iteration of the expression created by Parker Brothers, which has a particular board with a particular setup, particular names, particular rules, that is protected by copyright. Do you want to move to the next slide?
So as we'll see then, as we go through over the next few slides through the open gaming license and sort of what's being utilized and what IP is being utilized, is that in these games there actually is a lot of different forms of intellectual property that is actually subject to copyright. So what you're looking at then is, well, what is it that you can actually copyright? So the first category of copyrightable works is actually literary works. So what are literary works? Literary works would be books, poems, pamphlets, other works of text, as well as computer programs. So the sole distinguishing characteristic of a literary work is not in its quality as literature. Whatever you write, doesn't matter how crappy it is, you're still going to be entitled to some sort of intellectual property protection on it. It's the fact that it is simply written down in print, or you've written it in some form of writing. So it must be expressed to some extent in some sort of material form, which is actually capable of identification and having a character of reasonable substance or permanence. So as Bob mentioned, there's no copyright in an idea or in the information. So it's not an infringement of copyright to adopt the idea of another or to publish information derived from another, provided that there is no copying of the actual language in which the idea or the information was previously embodied. So it's on that basis that there can be no copyright in news, for example, as in and of itself, but only in the form in which the news is actually expressed. So the second category of works that's subject to protection is dramatic works. And this is any piece of recitation, choreographed work, or mime. You're in for a real treat today, as Bob has agreed to mime some Dungeons & Dragons routines. No? Yes? No?
Yeah, I'm very good at it, so it's going to come across well.
Or a scenic arrangement or acting form which has been somehow fixed, be it in writing or otherwise. So a film, video, DVD, plays, the screenplay, the script. As Bob mentioned, in regards to the plot or plans for a work, while the fundamental idea of a dramatic work is not protected, the combination of incidents or situations, the sequence of events, and sort of the mode in which the ideas are worked out may be protected, apart from the language in which they're specifically expressed. But the production of a similar work will not be restrained if the similarity between the two works is just coincidence, with both works being derived independently from a common stock of dramatic ideas. Unlike patents, where when a patent comes into play, no one else can use it, no one else can touch that product whatsoever. If you're sitting at your desk and you come up with an idea for a literary work and someone else was sitting at their desk in a different room and they came up with it, well, you're both allowed to publish your work because you came up with it on your own. That's the difference between how copyright and patents actually work. Musical works, not as relevant to our discussion today, but also worth mentioning. Compositions that consist of both words and music, or music only. Note that if you have lyrics without music, those actually fall into the category of literary works. In terms of fixation, the actual recording of musical works, originally what was really important was the preparation of the sheet music, because you needed some sort of fixation of the actual artistic work. However, now the general requirement is just that there be some sort of fixation. So a sound recording, for example, will create copyright in a musical work. Artistic works. Now these are sort of interesting in terms of how they play out over the course of the remainder of the lecture, and that paintings, drawings, maps, charts, plans, photographs, engravings, sculptures, works of artistic craftsmanship, and compositions are considered artistic works. And also relevant for today is that maps, charts, and plans were previously included in the definition of literary works. However, the Copyright Act was amended in 1988 to include them now under the category of artistic works. They were seen as literary works. They really wanted to limit that to just things that were written or in writing. So maps and charts, etc., were taken down into the category of artistic works. So all these components sort of form part of Dungeons & Dragons and sort of the makeup of the game itself, and sort of we'll get into how these IP concepts have now been used over time. So what can't you copyright? Well, there's a few things that are not subject to copyright protection. Titles, short word combinations. As Bob mentioned, ideas. So copyright is restricted specifically to the expression in a fixed manner, the text, the recording, the drawing, etc. of the idea, not the idea actually itself. Names, slogans, methods. By methods, what they're talking about is similar to what Bob was mentioning, a method of sculpting or a method of teaching. You can't have copyright over that. Plots or characters, again, not subject to copyright protection. And factual information. Facts, ideas, and news, they're all considered to be part of the public domain. That is, they're everyone's property, and no one can hold copyright over them.
Sorry, isn't there case law that says that characters are subject to copyright protection so long as they're described in sufficient?
That's just it, right? Yeah, specifically the character on its own, it's not, but when it's part of the entire work, titles, for example, titles in short word combinations, the title of a work, while on its own is not subject to copyright protection, can also be subject to copyright protection as part of the entire work. So there is situations where it's copyright. It's not black and white. There's no
Yeah.
fine lines, unfortunately. We're trying to keep it as basic as we can.
Can a judgment of a court be copyrighted? Is it copyrighted by the Crown? A judgment of a court, of a tribunal?
We've had recent
It's a very good
discussions on this.
question.
Yeah.
It depends who you talk to.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you go to the website of the Ontario courts, for like the Ontario courts website, they assert copyright in the judgments.
That's precisely the reason why I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
As a former administrative judge,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I must say I've asked them without any answer from them.
Yeah.
Who has the copyright? Is there any copyright on the judgment?
Yeah, I think
Since judges are legally independent,
absolutely.
there should be
The
no
Crown.
copyright.
Yeah, there's no sort of obvious reason. There's certainly nothing in the Copyright Act which would indicate that they do not have copyright. So I think the presumption is they do have copyright. And I think the question is, okay, well, who owns it? Whether it's the individual judge who rendered it or the Crown. Again, I think the answer has to be the judge, because there's no sort of obvious mechanism in the Act which says that a judge acting in their capacity as a judge automatically transfers copyright to the Crown. There's actually a class action suit,
And that's just it, yeah.
which is sort of live right now, which is considering the question of copyright in legal documents, so like pleadings and things like that, which may have some bearing on the answer. David Vaver wrote a great paper in the early 80s about copyright in legal documents, which touches on Vaver, V-A-V-E-R. I think it's in the Osgoode Hall Law Journal.
All right, so jump to the next one.
Okay. Okay, so as we've talked about the idea expression dichotomy, so are games protected by IP rights? I think the answer is yes, games are protected by IP rights. So the idea of a fantasy role-playing game is not protected, but the actual expression of that idea, the actual mechanics of the game as they are printed out on a page, that's protected, that iteration of its rules. This gets a little fuzzy around the edges, obviously, so clearly I can't take a page from a Dungeons & Dragons rule book and photocopy it. That's obviously prima facie infringement. But as an example, in Dungeons & Dragons, there's 4 primary races that you can play. You can play humans, elves, dwarves, or halflings. Is that idea, or is that concept copyrightable? It starts getting a little fuzzy, right? Like, can I come up with another game which has those 4 same races? Probably. But the more we sort of get into detailed iterations of expression, the more questionable it is as to what type of intellectual property right can be asserted over that expression. So there's something about games which is protected by IP, but it's a bit confusing to figure out what precisely. Trademarks are a little bit more clear. So names like Monopoly or Risk, Battleship, Settlers of Catan, all of those are clearly protected by trademark. And I think all of those, in fact, are registered trademarks. So just like Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is a registered trademark owned by Wizards of the Coast, or now Hasbro, actually. Could we just go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Just want to talk for a second about how the book and gaming industry work. Historically, they've been single source driven. What I mean by that is there's a single source, a publisher, an author, who generates the product and spreads it around throughout retail sales points. So there's an emphasis on tight brand control and control of the content. So, for example, Settlers of Catan. Has everybody played Settlers? Does everybody know what Settlers of Catan is? Excellent. So there's a core rule set, and then there's a whole bunch of expansion sets. The only people that will provide you with Settlers of the Catan, the only people who can provide you with Settlers of Catan, are the German publishers, a company called Cosmos. They license the rights out to various sort of distributors throughout the world. So when you get Settlers of Catan, or something that is branded Settlers of Catan, even if it's one of those expansion sets, you know you're getting it from the originals, the same original source, effectively. Dungeons & Dragons was set up in a similar way. There were 3 core rule books, And then TSR sold all of these different expansions. There were adventure modules, there were add-on rules, there were new sort of campaigns, new rule books. In the very early DIY years of the game, Gygax and Arneson allowed a number of people who were outside of TSR to create things and label them as compatible with Dungeons & Dragons. But once the game became more corporatized and TSR became sort of a large company, that got shut down. And TSR got a reputation as being a very aggressive enforcer of their IP rights. So they would threaten to sue people for writing things like compatible with Dungeons & Dragons on material. And they were also fairly robust in terms of their going after people creating games that they thought were sort of too similar to Dungeons & Dragons in terms of their mechanics, the game mechanics themselves. So for a couple of decades there, TSR was the only source of Dungeons & Dragons material. Final point I wanted to mention, which actually isn't on the slide, is that there's this notion in publishing of things being out of print. And so it's something we're all probably familiar with from the world of books. Printed products were generally created with an anticipated product life cycle. So they'd have a shelf life. You'd print up 50,000 copies of something. You'd try to sell it for 6 months or a year. If it sold lots of copies, you'd print more, you'd sell more. If it didn't sell, then it just sort of died. It kind of went away. Retailers didn't want to keep it on their shelves. They would return it to the publishers. The publishers didn't want to take up space in their warehouse, so they would pulp it, destroy it. And it went out of print. It was still protected by copyright, but it wasn't being sold anymore. It would just sort of disappear from the retail market, and so unless you had purchased one while it was in print, or you could find one, in a used bookstore, you're basically out of luck with respect to that product. In a digital environment, that's sort of a foreign concept, right? Now we have the ability to just keep copies, keep works in print constantly, because they're available digitally. They can be printed on demand, they can be downloaded. And so a little bit later on, that's going to become relevant to us again. How many people here are familiar with the open source concept? Fabulous. So for anybody who's not, the dominant kind of paradigm for software creation was that software was essentially locked. Nobody could get access to the source code. Source code was sort of the most important thing about software. In the, let's call it the mid to the late 90s, a different approach was proposed, and it basically said, what if we let everybody have access to our source code? And we let everybody sort of try and troubleshoot it and use it and manipulate it and try and improve it. So open source is this sort of approach, this development approach, this philosophy, which promotes access, which promotes transparency, which promotes, from these definitions here, free redistribution. And the idea is to try and make you're basically lifting up the hood of your car and letting everybody come in and say, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot. I want to see how this is going to work. I'm going to pull it apart. I'm going to poke at it. I'm going to try to improve this, make it better. And the way that you do that is by sort of allowing this to happen in a kind of collaborative manner and letting people work on it. This is a fairly revolutionary concept in licensing and intellectual property licensing. Intellectual property licensing is premised on the notion that there is a single source of control. You license things out under very strict terms. Open source was this sort of revolution in how these things were thought about. And we have some examples that of what are open source, the products of the open source movement.
Yeah, so open source obviously doesn't always mean that you're going to have success with the product you launch, but there are a number of examples where an open source business model did actually work. Linux being one of them. Linux is an operating system, very similar to Windows or OS X for the Mac, but something set Linux apart from these other operating systems, and that was that as an open operating system, Linux is developed collaboratively, meaning that no one company is actually solely responsible for its development or ongoing support. companies participating in the Linux economy share the research and development costs with their partners and also with their competitors. A stat on the Linux website says that over 1,000 developers from at least 100 different companies actually contribute to every single kernel release of the Linux OS. Android, which some would argue is the most popular mobile platform in the world, powers millions of the world's phones, tablets, and other devices. And again, building on contributions from the open source Linux community, more than 300 hardware, software, and carrier partners, Android is rapidly becoming one of the fastest growing mobile OSs in the world. Firefox is a web browser created by Mozilla, and the original creators of which other web browser did they create? Come on, show your age. Netscape. All right, good stuff. So version 1 of Firefox was released in 2004, and it was pretty quick to gain fan support because of its open source license and the multitude of features that you could adopt into the browser itself. And multiple new versions have been released since 2004, with each update pulling in new features and improving its security as well as it goes along. OpenOffice.org is a volunteer-run project with the aim of building a world-class office suite, which is available to anyone to use. Other sources of open source, you have things like content, like Wikipedia. Hardware, as we mentioned, with Android, a lot of that is used in developing the Android system. But one that I thought was pretty interesting that brought to my attention was beverages. So, Open Cola. Has anyone ever heard of Open Cola? Okay. Well, let me tell you the story of Open Cola. So Open Cola was a brand of cola, unique in that the instructions for making it were actually freely available and modifiable. So anybody could make the drink, and anyone could modify and improve on the recipe, as long as they too licensed their recipe out through a general public license. So although this was originally intended as a promotional tool to explain what open source software actually was, the drink actually took a life of its own. Interestingly, this was a Toronto-based cola company, became better known for the drink than the software that they were actually trying to produce. So a guy named Laird Brown, is he here? Laird? No? I was hoping he might be here. Laird Brown was the company's senior strategist, and a website selling this cola actually shipped 150,000 cans out to the general public. The company is no longer around, but since the recipe and the instructions are actually open source, you can still go online and find those instructions. And if you have, and this is how these markets work together hand in hand, is if you have a few $100,000 in technology, you can actually manage to whip up a batch of open source cola for yourself.
So, what does the open source movement have to do with Dungeons and Dragons? As I mentioned earlier, in 2000, with the third edition of the game, the makers of the game, Wizards of the Coast, decided to take inspiration from the open source movement and apply it to gaming. And what they came up with was the open game license. So they had a page and a half long, it's a snappy little document, and they said, you got this open source concept for software, that's awesome, we're going to create this open game license for our game. And again, I don't want to get too melodramatic about this, but this is pretty radical stuff in the world of intellectual property licensing. So it's the sort of rough equivalent, the analogy is not exact, it's the rough equivalent of the makers of the Call of Duty series of games saying, here's our source code. You think you can make a better Call of Duty game? Knock yourself out. Here's the source code, go for it. Make something even better than what we've done. Or it's like Marvel and Marvel Studios saying, you think you can make a better Avengers movie? Here's the Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. Go for it. Let's see what you can do. That's exactly what Wizards of the Coast did here. They allowed access to the source code for Dungeons & Dragons. They created a system reference document, which was basically a sort of summary of all of the Dungeons & Dragons rules. They created the open gaming license, and they said, so long as you comply with the open gaming license, you can make use of this source code. Basically, hack it up. Come up with a better game than what we've done. You want to make, a rules add-on for D&D? Go for it. You want to make it sort of, fantasy combined with science fiction? It's all yours. Here's our sandbox. You can play in it. So the open gaming license took its cues from the open source movement. One of those sort of critical notions was this share and share alike notion. So if you use the open source license, the open gaming license, you have to make your content subject to the open gaming license. So other people can then use your content and remix it, make their own game with it. Now, it's not completely open, right? There's still some restrictions on what people can do. The primary way that they did this was by drawing a distinction between what was called open game content and product identity. So product identity were things like trademarks. So if you want to come up with a new game using the D&D mechanic, you can't call your new game Dungeons & Dragons. You have to call it something else. And they also use product identity to apply to things that copyright law, as Sundeep mentioned, don't necessarily apply to. So things like names, things like plot lines, things like stories, things like sort of inchoate ideas. They said all of that stuff is product identity, but everything else is open game license, open game content. Knock yourself out with it. And this had a huge rejuvenating impact on Dungeons & Dragons. The sales of it sort of soared. As I mentioned earlier, in the late 90s, the brand was essentially dead. It wasn't as big as the early 80s when the game was a true sort of cultural phenomenon, but there was certainly a massive improvement as compared to the 90s. How might we assess the open gaming license if I was going to look at it as a lawyer? It's only 2 pages long. Lawyers tend to prefer things to be nice and complicated and long. So it's actually a little bit confusing. It's one of those situations where the simplicity of the document is actually counterintuitively a barrier to understanding it. It took me a couple of times of reading it to really understand how it worked. There's a sort of 5-page frequently asked questions document which explains how it works. It's sometimes more restrictive than the general law which is applicable. So trademarks, for example. The open gaming license says you can't make use of product identity. One of the things which is designated as product identity is the name Dungeons & Dragons. So you can't put compatible with Dungeons & Dragons on your product if you use the open gaming license. That's not how trademark law works generally. If I make something and I want to put something like compatible with Dungeons & Dragons on there, I can do that. I'm not infringing anybody's trademark. If I use the open gaming license and I do the same thing, I am infringing it. So, and then there's this one-way street concept, which is once something gets designated as open game content, it can't be undesignated. It's a perpetual license. So once something goes open game content, it is forever open game content. And that will have that's an important thing which will impact the remainder of this story. So a really funny thing sort of happened once the open game license was introduced. So let's remember for a second, the open game license was supposed to reinvigorate Dungeons & Dragons. It was supposed to make the 3rd edition this really cool thing which everybody was going to buy. And it did that to a certain extent. But then what happened was people took the open gaming license and they did something a little weird, something which almost nobody could have predicted. And what they did was they reverse engineered the system reference document. And people that had grown up with Dungeons & Dragons in the 70s and 80s said, you know what, I don't want to play 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. I want to play 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons. I want to play the original game. And the open gaming license lets me do that. All of these books which are out of print, which I can't find anymore, I'm going to recreate them. I'm going to take the system reference document and I'm going to remake Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to play the game that I want to play. So the rough analogy is sort of like if somebody took Super Mario Galaxy, which is one of the sort of more recent Mario games. Somebody said, you know what, that's really great. I'm going to hack in there, get into the source code, and I'm going to recreate Super Mario Brothers for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which came out in 1985. I'm going to play that game. So it's sort of retrograde in its kind of sensibility. It's got this very strong nostalgia element. This is what was has become to be called the old school Renaissance, this recreation of Dungeons and Dragons. And then we have an interleaving of sort of factors here. This sort of perfect storm occurs. So you have the open gaming license, which comes out, and then various types of technology start getting widely distributed. So the first is the lowly little PDF document, right, which people take for granted, but it's actually a fairly remarkable invention. One of the first things that Wizards of the Coast did in the late 90s was they took all of the old Dungeons & Dragons material, scanned it all in, turned it into PDF documents, put it online, and said, here it is. Go for it. Do whatever you want with it. It's all open game content. So the PDF, though it seems a little pedestrian, is remarkable in the sort of freedom it allows people, right? You can use materials across a wide variety of platforms and devices. And so it opens up, it reminded people of all these things which used to be there, which had gone out of print. And it gave them to them in a way which was accessible and which could be sort of freely manipulated. Then you have the introduction of very high quality, very low cost print-on-demand technology. So if you want to self-publish a book today, you can create a storefront on the internet, or you can sell your book through a variety of different portals. And you don't have to print up 50,000 copies of the book and make that investment and take the gamble and see if people are going to buy it. You just print it up as people decide that they want to download it or purchase it. And if anybody's ever used any of these print-on-demand services, I mean, the better ones are really quite amazing. There's literally no distinction between a professional quality, mass-published book created by Simon & Schuster as compared to a print-on-demand book. I mean, there may be differences in the content quality, there may be differences in the quality of the art that they can pay for, but the actual physical artifact itself is virtually indistinguishable. It looks great. And then you have social media, like internet forums and blogs and Twitter and wikis, which enable all of this community creation. So the internet allows members of this dispersed community, all these people who like role-playing games, to connect with each other and trade ideas and stories and things that they've created, and it sort of organically grows into this little ecology of its own. And then on top of that, you add something like crowdfunding, where if you really want to get serious about something, you reach out to your fellow gamers. You ask them to
I should have
pitch
had
in.
this up in the background.
Oh, it's
You're
okay.
explaining all these concepts.
So RPG Now is sort of a portal for role-playing gamers. You can go on there. They have discussion forums. They have products that you can purchase. Publishers can create their own storefronts. Individual authors can create their own product pages. And it's basically, if you're like an RPG nerd, like this is where you go and you get all your stuff. Right? And all of this is inherently designed to be accessible to and utilized by individuals and small companies. This is not a massive operation which is intended to be provide a channel for big publishers. So you put all of this stuff together. Here's crowdfunding. Do people know how crowdfunding works? So you come up with an idea, you say, hey, give me a bunch of stuff. If I get to this one that looks like they're looking for $40,000, if I get to $40,000, I'm going to make this happen. And so it's an easy way to use very small contributions to aggregate together to create a product. Yes?
What happens to the money if they don't make their goal?
Unless the goal is met, the money is never actually collected. So you sort of sign up and say, I want to contribute. Here's my credit card number. Only when the goal is met is your credit card charged.
Show the examples.
Sure. So we sort of draw all these threads together, and what you have is the old school Renaissance. So it's the rebirth now of old Dungeons and Dragons. So this is a worldwide community of thousands and tens of thousands of people who are creating new entertainment product from a dead brand. If you want to play old school D&D, there's now dozens of competing products made by hobbyists, so all of which have been made using the open gaming license to create replicas of old school D&D. So they have names like Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry, Adventures Dark and Deep, Dungeon Crawl Classics. There's a resurgence of magazines which service this community. There's all kinds of online forums. Just to put some flesh on the bones here, James Malasevsky, who's a Toronto boy, wanted to publish something called Dwimmermount, a mega dungeon. He was looking for $10,000. As you can see, he managed to raise nearly $50,000. Nobody's going to retire on this stuff, or at least not on this. But 50 grand is really not a bad chunk of change. Let's look at the next one.
What was all the different?
Oh, okay. So yeah, the way that crowdfunding works generally is, or at least Kickstarter in particular, is it's not that you're getting sort of an equity interest in the property. You can contribute different amounts, and for different amounts you get different rewards. So if you contribute $20, let's say, you'll get a copy of Dwimmermount. If you contribute $40, you'll get a signed copy of Dwimmermount. If you contribute more, you'll get your name or the name of your character included in the game. If you pledge $10,000 or more, you will get miniatures. You will be honored with both the Magister and the Monstrous Magister awards. So you get, basically, it's an effort to try and give people an incentive to contribute to the property without actually making them sort of equity owners of the property. Another example of an old school game, Ogre, was a war game that was released in the late 1970s. The publishers of it have decided to come out with a new version, the Designer's Edition. They used Kickstarter. This is actually now old.
That's old, yeah. It's a couple days old now.
A couple days old. They wanted $20,000 in order to make it happen. When this got screenshot,
3 days ago, yeah.
$632,000. I think last night we looked at it, it was like $850,000. So there's real money to be made in doing this. And so sort of setting aside the kind of general weirdness of Dungeons & Dragons, here we've got, this was a survey of 150 different projects, not including the two that we've just looked at. They managed to get money from almost 17,000 people, raise nearly more than $750,000.
Can I just ask you a question on that, the last couple slides?
Sure.
I mean, if I'm someone who wants to fund one of these things, and I see that there are multiples over their target, do people actually still give them the money if they see that they only need 20, but now they're 800,000? Won't there be a lot of people who will just walk away?
No, because what they do is they come up
Or do they
with...
take the money up front?
They don't take the money up front, but what they do is they come up with sort of super goals, so super incentives. So they say, we need $20,000 in order to make this game. But if we get $25,000, then what we're going to do is we're going to send everybody, a free deluxe hardback version of the game. And they keep coming up with more and more games. And what actually they did for Ogre there was, as they kept getting more and more money, they said, okay, if we get to the next threshold, we're going to come out with new versions of other games. So you started off with Ogre, and then they tried to bring in other games. So without, again, getting too melodramatic about this, there's something really interesting happening here, because you've got these really sort of incredibly rich and dynamic movements which have sprung up, made possible only because of the intersection of the open gaming license and all of this new technology. And in a sense, everything has sort of come full circle. Dungeons & Dragons started off as this do-it-yourself hobbyist kind of game and movement. It became this very corporate brand, which sort of got played out and died a little bit of a death and stagnated. And then the open gaming license really reinvigorated the hobbyist and do-it-yourself elements. And now, because of the empowerment which has been afforded by this technology, the distinction between sort of the quality and the profitability of professional gaming and hobbyist gaming has essentially disappeared. And so we think this has some lessons for other types of entertainment endeavors. Right? So fan fiction, I think, is a great example. Does everybody know what fan fiction is? So it's people using characters and elements from existing entertainment properties to write their own fiction. You know, Star Trek was sort of the original, I think, example where people would use Star Trek characters and create fan fiction. That's a great example of something which is almost like the open gaming license. Somebody could the owner of the brand could sit there and say, you know what, have at it. Here's our characters. If you want to use them, you can't sell it, can't make any money off it. But if you want to make some, create a little community where you write all this stuff and try to improve on the stories, tell the stories that you want to hear with these characters, go for it. And so the question becomes, whether this can be made applicable, this open gaming license sort of framework can be used on other properties, other stagnated properties which are sort of sitting there out of print, which haven't been sort of used in any meaningful way. We're good? Are there any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
How's Wizards of the Coast actually doing as a result of this resurgence?
They're doing good. Wizards of the Coast was eventually purchased by Hasbro, which is one of the two sort of toy giants. Hasbro and Mattel are the kind of ogres of the scene. They're doing good. They came out with a 4th edition of D&D in 2008, which was quite successful. And they are supposed to be coming out with a 5th edition soon. So it's an interesting question because people have said, well, is this actually to their benefit, right? Like people are creating hobbyist versions of this and buying the hobbyist versions. That means presumably they're not buying, the Wizards of the Coast version or the Hasbro version. There's sort of two schools of thought. I don't know that there's a lot of empirical evidence which has been applied to this. It's sort of that long tail theory, or it's an application of the long tail theory where the way they should be making the money is by, selling the old products. You might only sell 4 dozen of them, but it's better to get 4 dozen than nothing.
Sell the PS for a dollar.
Exactly. And that's what they were doing at the end of the 90s, and in the early 2000s. So, and there's an argument, some people make the argument, look, it keeps the brand alive, right? Even though people are using it, are using the sort of the underlying mechanics to create their own games, it keeps the community alive. And so that's how, at some point, because it's still alive, they'll be able to monetize it somewhere down the road. Yeah.
Assuming that what I'm going to say is based on non-commercial usages, would there be really any need for these open licenses or a CC license once the UGC exception gets passed in C11?
That's a really good question. I do not know. I haven't. You know what? I don't know. I can't remember the wording of how.
Yeah, well, I mean, with UGC, the issue with that is obviously there can be no commercial exploitation of what you're creating. So that would sort of, if these guys are doing this and trying to sell it, then you're done. That's just purely for your own sort of use and entertainment. But again, with UGC, very timely Monday, they're going to be looking at the 3rd reading of Bill C11, Monday, Tuesday. So it's hard to say how the UGC provision is going to end up in the end.
But that's an interesting point. That maybe something like this has just been baked into our or is it just about to be baked into our Copyright Act? I like that. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Has the concept been applied in other areas of software development?
Not that I mean, it started off with software. It's moved to the gaming model. I haven't seen it actually explicitly applied anywhere. These sort of strike me as the most appropriate areas for potential development because the model that you're looking for is you have a project or a work or a brand in the ideal place that is still subject to copyright protection, but is kind of lying fallow. Nobody's making use of it. So old video games strike me as a sort of a great sort of there's a lot of potential there. Old comic books, pulp novels, movies, and TV shows from previous years that aren't being exploited in any sense. Yeah.
There actually is like a movement in literature now called erasurism or erasurists.
Yeah.
And they're like Jonathan Safran Foer just did one, a bunch of authors are doing them. And what they do is they take old books where there's no license, but there's also no active protection of the book, and they essentially they're either erasing words from the book to create a new story, or what Jonathan Safran Foer did was he actually cut words out of the pages. So you could see through the pages down to other words, but it made a new story. So it's very interesting. I mean, the question becomes, well, is there new copyright in this and yada, yada, yada. But in a way, it's like these old novels are actually becoming open source because you can derive, right? Now, I don't know if you actually would need an open source license in those cases because technically it's a modification, so is it a new work? But, I mean, it's similar. But with video games, I mean, you saw all sorts of problems in the 80s and 90s, like with Doom and Wolfenstein, and they had to make your own levels.
Yeah.
And then it was UGC issue, right? So back then they got sued.
So what you have to remember is the works are all still protected by copyright.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is a specific example where the copyright owner has said, go ahead and you can play with this or whatever. But if it's still protected by copyright, you have to respect the copyright of the original creator.
It depends whether they enforce it or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happens when you have something like you have one of these open licenses and somebody makes a Kickstarter and it goes like 300% over their goal? Are they not now making money off of this?
Yeah, the open gaming license is not restricted to non-commercial activities. Like they specifically said, if you want to sell this, go for it. If you want to make money off it, go for it. You don't owe us a royalty. We're stepping back and sort of, quit claiming any right we have to anything you want to do. So all of these things that we've been discussing, like the Dwemer Mount, the Ogre, all of those games that I mentioned, those are all for-profit activities. People are making money off of them. Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your patience.